Okay, so I had another. There's actually a Descartes and Heiddeger Part 1, which got erased um, due to the fact that I tried to upload it, and then since I have limited memory on the phone, I tried to erase it and start Part 2 before it was completely uploaded. So there were some things that were left out that should be gone into. One is so what is Heidegger's relation to Descartes? Um, Heidegger troubles himself to look at Descartes' letters in order to demonstrate that the formula um, cognito ergo sum is not an inference, that the ergo is not like a syllogistic machine for inferences by which we, in the episteme, as it were. I did some things on this, by the way, on my old website, episteme ratio.com, because I don't, it's not at all clear except by this standard, Heidegger standard, where he says ultimately there's no higher judge, that Heidegger's claim can be there's no standard to say that it's the right thing. We can only just say it's Heidegger claims to see something, and then maybe we can see it too. That's about all we can do. Because as soon as you would say there's a standard, then you've limited what you're talking about, such that you're not dealing with the whole thing anymore, even though the whole is present in every part of it. But exactly how Heidegger understands himself to have made an advance beyond Husserl is not that clear. I mean, we have the verbal statements about the Bewusstsein, our consciousness, and that Husserl, things that we've discussed before, that Husserl thinks of this on an analogy with sense data and so on. But an inference such as, say, one were to say, leaves are from trees, here's a leaf, therefore here is something from a tree, always, it leads us into formal logic, which is the same things we were just going over in math and the simplicity of getting used to mathematical systems and stuff. Like, you can get used to a formal logic system, but then the problem is that everything hangs on whether your initial claims are true or not. So, like, for instance, the whole theme of the Magritte stuff about this is not a pipe. So maybe we have something on the ground which is an artificial leaf, and we're taking it for a leaf, and then we say this is a leaf, and then we say this is something from a tree. Well, it's not from a tree because it was made by an artisan of some sort, or produced on one of these machines that can do three-dimensional printing or something. But then the whole question of what accounts to be a leaf would come in, and Heidegger says that the beings are there in our memory when we're thinking of a memory, rather than remembering. Remembering meaning getting our mind to draw up the memory. But once we already have the memory there, as it were, and we are in the act of doing the imagination, picturing, or I suppose the word memory originally means mimicking somehow, mimesis. So we're according to the thinking in the language, we're mimicking the happening, But people like um, Bergson, Henri Bergson says the memories are just a less intense form of the same thing that we're doing in what we usually call real life. But Heiddeger says something different, where he says that's the being in the memory, just as it's the being not in the memory. So that's a pipe. That's the being of a pipe in the Magritte picture, even though the words there say this is not a pipe. Um, but exactly how we are to understand that is more difficult to approach. But you can see that for Heidegger, we can't do the system where you make cognito ergo sum into a logical inference where everything is presupposed. Rather, the doubt um, starts by making a sort of a claim, which is a sort of an abstraction from what happens. We can think the thing over, everything, and then myself, and then we can come to a conclusion like whatever experiences we're having, it's always from a certain it's this just once this time, because it's always from the accidental position of, you could say, from our physical existence, but then you'd have to explain what physical means, but from our singular life, right? It's the experience from that singular position of ourselves. And then you can say from that the whole is different for each Dasein, and the whole, which is the same for all, is nonetheless comes forward from a different position in different historical position for each Dasein. You can understand that in various ways. So it seems that Descartes takes this sort of in stride because he wants to get to the clear and distinct talk. But once he has the sort of saying that everything is a kind of, as Husserl later will call it, the thing bracketed it so that even if it's an illusion, Husserl gives the example of greeting a stage dummy out in front of the Museum of Natural History in some large German city, thinking that it was some acquaintance. Husserl, being a university professor who had a large number of acquaintances who he wouldn't have known that well, and he didn't want to be impolite. But that experience of taking the dummy for the acquaintance actually happened, even though later we corrected through common sense and say, no, that was just it was like a sort of almost an hallucination. I think in terms of this question of the negative truth, of the aletheia, in some way this corresponds to the older idea, an idea of genius. If you think of genius as something which, for instance, in Goethe had this facility of something that reminds of the so-called lucid dreaming. He had this power of hallucinating, which was very strong, but also which aided him immensely in his artistic output. He could see flowers blossoming before him at will, and so on. This could be taken as a defect, but if it's viewed as something which brings into the world something which is gratifying to let's say, the rational essence of the human being, so that, say, some physicist brings into the world some understanding which later becomes passed on to other physicists, and it's viewed as good, even though Einstein, Einstein actually couldn't do basic math, and his main skill was a kind of intuition, and he came to the view later on that he would have preferred to burn his hands off than bring into existence what he brought into existence, of course, the nuclear weapons. But one doesn't necessarily sense that Einstein meant that all that seriously, because like the rest of us, he's in this position where we don't understand these things as well as they used to be understood in some respects, because I think Newton, when Goethe says, as quoted by Nietzsche, that Newton had this deep feeling of having committed having committed an error, which left him. It reminds me of the feeling of hurt honor of Lord Jim in the book by that title by um, uh, Conrad, which is viewed as a morbid subject by many of Conrad's early readers. But this acute sense that certain forms of knowledge could be wrong and could be should be rejected by the human essence. And Newton was into all these forms of mysticism and other things, and the building up of the calculus probably had to do somewhat to do with the sort of storm of concomitant antecedents, which others also partook on, and wasn't necessarily a great act of genius. Um, I would tend to contribute more genius to this ability to um, translate algebra into geometric terms. Um, I don't remember if I mentioned this in a lot. A mathematician friend of mine, Richard Wong Q, used to say that for a true mathematician, mathematics would somehow not be worthwhile without geometry. So, like, geometry is what you want to bring things to because you can picture it, but even the most complex algebras um, and topologies can be translated, as long as they can be translated with some sort of minimal, how do they call it, abstract nonsense, which is a sort of semi-technical term, which means you maybe lose something in the translation sometimes in these more complex systems. But I don't know that Newton really thought his main work was putting together this Principia Mathematica, his form of the calculus. His other work was perhaps more important to him, um, for the reason it had to do less with generic compounding of meaningless knowledge in the current scientific sense, where you just compound things as though in an isolation chamber, and then later on you ask what's the meaning for human beings of this, and 9 out of 10 things you invent could be totally destructive, but you don't consider that while you're doing the science. You're supposed to just go away from common sense as much as possible and get rid of all your presuppositions, right? So scientific thinking is totally different than the thinking of the tradition, which has had more to do with what we now pass off as moral thinking, but it was reason, I would say, reason, and sense that reason is supposed to be only just this minimal step above what the other animals can do. Like if you read Aristotle, it's like there's, like, say for instance, Aristotle's analysis of that there's noise, and there's like guttural voice of, say, a bear or something. Then there's articulate speech of birds and so on, which is more complex. And then there's just this little step more for the human being. Human being is still an animal with this special little bit more faculties. But if you look at it from the point of view of the modern way of thinking of Descartes and then Kant, you get caught where you don't know whether to go into this extreme romanticism or what to do, because the position of deism against faith opens up the position where you get Newton and so on come in, and you say, oh, God is allowed for Newton to come in. We should be really grateful for this. There's no miracles. There's no communication through earthquakes and Zeus hurling his lightning bolts to tell us something, or rainbows or whatnot. People become more deist, and then you gradually sort of even get into the position we're in now, where people don't even raise the question in any serious way, except a few intellectual pundits, but generally it's not necessary for someone living in the society to raise the question because it's sort of been reduced to rubbles. All these kind of hang around this Cartesian and Heideggerian space where we're asking whether we can systematically have the position of, did I say this in the last video about the hope? I think I did say hope and optimism, how they differ. That's a subject matter which is topical these days. But I think there's some insight if you look, to get closer to Heidegger, if you look through these analysis of William James, where he shows on consciousness. His writings on William James's writing on consciousness are very, they touch on the threshold of Heideggerian thinking in many ways, where he shows the dismissal of the old soul thinking, which became identified, say, in Bertrand Russell with psychology, and which he had basically understood as conditioned response. Deism creates a situation where you strictly can deal with the things that are historically conditioned and the things which cause people to have certain opinions and stuff out of the past. Put everything into terms of conditioned response, but only save the highest part of the necessary logic, right? But on the other hand, you have this leftover moral questions or the value questions. In William James, he talks about how if you were just to describe consciousness, because consciousness is basically a vapid word which means nothing, it just means the same thing as everything that exists. So then you'd have to say it is conscious. Like just in the same way as, say, talk about abiotic terms or it is naturing, as it were. Nature is naturing. The natural processes are happening. It's not like it belongs to a person in the Catholic sense. So Heidegger kind of takes this whole it is conscious thing, but then he wants to show that there's also some way we're intervening into it, some way that even though it's not a subject, the world itself, which is us, or the it that is consciousing, is somehow intervening into itself, within itself. Right? This is at play within these, directly within these Cartesian terms of the cognito ergo sum. That's what one should try to think about that in thinking through Heidegger, Husserl, and Descartes, and that whole period of what's at play there, where deism is coming in, where the fact-value distinction is coming in, and these other difficulties.